So we've talked a little bit about this idea of grievances as a source of conflict, and I'd like to kind of push back against that a little bit more today using a theory of resource mobilization, which I think has become probably one of the decisive critiques of grievances as an explanation, and ends up being sort of the foundation for where we're going to go to lay out some of the more contemporary political science research on why we see conflict breakout when and where we do. So the critique that resource mobilization theory offers of frustration, aggression, and other theories that focus on grievances is that grievances don't really help us to explain why we see civil war break out, why we see ethnic conflict, why we see, intercommunal violence, in part because grievances are always present. They're just part of the world. There's always enough grievances out there to fuel anger and to fuel conflict. And so grievance theories like frustration aggression and Gurr's Why Men Rebel sort of book try to come up with ways to kind of modify that to explain why we see rebellion happening in particular moments, but those end up not being fully satisfactory. And we also don't necessarily have a way to take into consideration the interaction between elites and the masses. So this is one of the things that we talked about when we talked about ethnic conflict, is that elites can use institutions and they can use their resources to mobilize the population to sort of stoke grievances and intercommunal hostility. But I'm going to also kind of circle back to this idea that this fundamental problem of grievances don't really help us to explain why we see violence break out when it does, because they're kind of always there. And just like with primordialism, that idea that sort of, ethnic hatreds are rooted deep in people, if they're ever present, how can we use that as a variable to explain why we see conflict when we do? And so resource mobilization sort of steps back and says, well, what actually has to happen in order for grievances to turn into an actual conflict? And they'll note that the problem is oftentimes getting people organized and mobilized. And that's really difficult. That you have to get people to sort of focus on those grievances. You need to get them sort of in the same room and organize meetings and come up with a way of financing things and sourcing supplies. And there needs to be some sort of vision that kind of mobilizes things, both at sort of the unit level and a larger strategic level. And these people who take the lead in facilitating this kind of organization can be thought of as movement entrepreneurs. And we see movement entrepreneurs in sort of the non-conflict space and sort of social movement space. But we also can take that idea of these movement entrepreneurs and think about them as essentially Civil War starters, as like a professional activity of, well, being an entrepreneur, taking the means of production together and putting them together in a way that facilitates making things happen. And so resource mobilization theory notes that a movement entrepreneur is likely to be successful when they're able to bring together the correct mix of resources. And that without those resources and without the movement entrepreneur to bring them together, nothing really happens. It doesn't matter how widespread or how egregious the grievances that people have are. People don't rise up when they're mad, they rise up when they're mobilized. And so in order to get people to rise up and strike at the state and launch a civil war requires supplying guns and cash and mobilizing troops and putting all that together through an entrepreneurial process. Okay, now in order to do that, there's very specific skills that are needed for military action, and these skills are not always ubiquitous within society, right? So effective military units are well trained and they have some very specialized skills. That's what makes military units effective. It's not just that soldiers are really mad or worked up, it's that they are able to work together as coherent units. They're able to be disciplined, they're able to work with the equipment that they have, and they're able to act effectively as units. And in order to build those kind of skills requires some very requires some experience with that, and requires people who are willing to put in the time and energy to build those skill sets and maintain those skill sets. In addition to just sort of, can you operate tactically as a unit and shoot your gun, there's a whole network required for supply lines, right? To be able to maintain logistics and make sure that people have access to boots, have access to ammunition. The ammunition matches the guns that people have. These are not trivial things for rebellions. In fact, Guevara, when talking about like the logistics of getting a guerrilla movement up and running, talks about the preeminence of sourcing boots. That there's a famous line that walking is fighting for the guerrilla. That remaining mobile is the most effective thing that you can do, and that requires boots. And if you're not able to source boots for your soldiers, there's nothing that they're going to be able to do. They're not going to be able to walk. They're not going to be able to fight. They're not going to be able to escape and move. You need somebody to recruit people into a movement. And again, that's a different skill set than being able to shoot a gun. Being able to work with words, being able to work social networks is a different kind of skill set. You need people who can be the political voice, whether that means that they have enough distance from the system or from the military action that they can function as a legitimate actor within sort of the non-conflict aspects of society, or whether they have a level of prestige and recognition that allows them to function as a spokesperson, right? Having that person can be very effective in terms of advancing a movement, right? And very specialized skills around weapon systems that rebel groups, terrorist groups tend to have people who are very specialized in building bombs and making improvised explosive devices. That these are not just things that people are cooking up sort of on the fly on their own. This sort of centralized knowledge that's guarded very carefully, that people have built up this skill set, and it is really vital that when it's lost in an organization, the organization's ability to conduct operations is greatly diminished. So there's all these skills that are required to be able to run an effective military operation. But when we start thinking about other resources that can be brought to bear, geography ends up being a really important one. In fact, some of the research on conflict and when conflict breaks out suggests that geography might even be the greatest risk factor for civil war. And part of that is just a function of, like, if you think about what it takes to be able to bring people together, to train them, to mobilize them, and to do that in a way that's very hostile to the state, cities are really not a good place to do that, because in cities there's lots of people. They're going to overhear what you're doing. It's very difficult to be secretive about your movements, particularly if you're doing something nefarious. People will notice. And there's also lots of agents of the state in cities, right? There are police, there are all sorts of security forces. They will be able to converge and crush a nascent militant movement that's trying to operate within cities. So militant movements operating within cities have to be especially focused on secrecy and running covertly. That's not conducive to running training camps or barracks or supply lines. That kind of stuff requires space, and that kind of stuff needs to be beyond the reach of the state. And so that might mean a foreign military base. Foreign military bases can be really critical resources. I worked with a guy a number of years ago on a project looking at decapitation strikes and rebel groups and the effectiveness of defeating rebel groups. And one of the weird things that we found that kind of broke our model is we couldn't find examples where a rebel group that had access to a foreign base was ever militarily defeated, because that it allows the group to regenerate, it allows them to continue, and as long as that military base exists, they're going to be a thorn in the side of the state. If you don't have access to a foreign military base, rugged terrain, basically mountains, can be a really valuable resource. That we find that civil wars tend to start in countries with mountains. That mountains allow for people to operate without the government being able to observe them, right? These are rural areas, they're sparsely populated, they're good places to set up training camps and bases, and the governments typically have very limited presences in mountainous regions, and so mountains end up being ideal terrain to facilitate rebellion. Probably not surprising given the ubiquitousness of conflict in Afghanistan and the difficulty of the state in suppressing rebel movements in Afghanistan. Another resource that we could talk about would be social networks. And so if we're thinking about recruitment, social networks are really important. That ends up being one of the primary drivers of how people get pulled into rebel movements. Well, I shouldn't say that. One of the primary drivers is simply abduction or conscription or draft. But for folks who volunteer to join, it's social pressure. It's my cousin joined, and therefore I'm going to join up as well. Maybe it's the peer pressure of my cousins asking me to, but maybe it's also just the security piece of my cousins vouching for me. And so this movement that's kind of nascent and is trying to figure out how to like operate without government agents infiltrating and destroying it, are going to rely very heavily on those friendship networks, those kin networks, those ethnic networks to screen out potential allies from potential adversaries. And so dense social networks can be very helpful in getting a rebellion up and off the ground and moving, both for recruitment, but also for financing and getting people to supply resources to those movements. And so this ties us back to some of the conversations we've been having earlier about ethnic conflict, that this can be a resource that a movement can draw upon, those ethnic ties that might exist within a group. We're going to talk a lot more over the coming weeks about two really critical resources, guns and cash. I don't think it's particularly surprising that an effective rebellion requires access to guns and ammunition, and this can be really the critical barrier in getting a rebellion launched. How do you actually secure these weapons? And so we'll talk about different ways in which groups go about securing weapons, and we'll talk about how that affects how the group evolves over time. Likewise, cash ends up being really important. Do you have access to a population that you can tax or that will voluntarily support you? Do you have access to a diamond mine? Do you have access to natural resources that you can sell off? You're going to have to find some way to generate cash. In fact, rebel organizations and criminal organizations sometimes look almost identical because a big part of what they're trying to do is figuring out how to generate large sums of money while doing that in a way that the state can't sort of squeeze off and crush the way that it could with something that was operating sort of within the legal economy. So cash is going to be a really critical resource. And then the final sort of thing I'll leave us with as we're discussing or introducing this idea of resources as the critical factor in explaining why we see conflict when we do, is that how much you need to mobilize, how many resources a resource entrepreneur or a movement entrepreneur needs to be able to have at their disposal depends, right? And it might depend on the goal. So if I'm trying to overthrow the state, that maybe requires more resources than if I'm trying to carve off a chunk of territory on the periphery of a state and I just need to deny the state access to that territory, right? So those goals may determine how big of a lift that rebellion actually is. Secondly, we need to think about the strength of the government. And again, one of the things that really helps explain when we see rebellion or where we see rebellion is government capacity. Governments that are able to engage in taxation, governments that are able to have field effective police forces and militaries tend to be able to crush rebel movements before they reach the point of a full-fledged civil war. Whereas weak states that maybe struggle to control their territory, that struggle with corruption, that maybe don't have a solid or reliable tax base, are going to really struggle against a rebel movement and may see that rebel movement take off because they don't have the existing capacity to crush it. And so if you are challenging a strong state, the amount of resources you're going to require are going to be significant. If you're challenging a weak state, maybe the resources are far fewer. And if the state has collapsed, and we did talk about political transitions and state collapse as one of those moments where we likely see conflict break out, well, the resource requirements to have a rebellion or a civil war or effectively, militarize your group under those circumstances are far lower than you would need when you're facing an actual state. So the strength of government ends up being a really critical factor. And the final thing I'll say is that it kind of depends, because depending on the resources that you can have different a rebel movement may evolve in very different ways in response to the resources. And so when we read Jeremy Weinstein's Inside Rebellion, he really makes this case that whether you have access to social networks for your primary resources or whether you have access to things like a diamond mine, that's going to be really important for how a rebel group evolves, for the tactics that it employs, for the strategies that it employs, and essentially in how that rebel group actually approaches the conflict in a very macro sense. So it's an interesting story, but again, resources end up being at the very center of that story.